face scans are something that I think they're really important in hybrids. And as of today, if you have the Bellis 3D app on your phone, you can keep using it. However, they're discontinuing it. I'm very disappointed. Bellis 3D was a free app that charged you $1 to export a face scan. We would do 2 face scans, one just smiling and one retracted, so the lab can measure things up, but it's no longer. So another option you have in the upper right is the Cirex Smile design. This is also present in ExoCAD and 3Shape, where you can actually add a photo and have it wrapped around a dummy model. Not as accurate as a traditional face scan. We'll talk about the different ones. But if you look at the image in the lower right, you can see that that patient really should not have had a hybrid. They should have had an overdenture. The fault is really not with the lab, because the lab only gets your scanning or your impression information. So, by doing a face scan, the lab gets all this good data. It gets patient's midline, gingival display, the size of the teeth relative to the patient's face. So using a face scan is a really good idea. Now, I think I went over this case in our first few videos on 3D printing. I just want to go over it again because a very common question I get is, okay, 3D printing is pretty cool. I want to 3D print a temporary hybrid on my patient and I want to scan them. How do I do that same day? How do I take a patient with a bunch of teeth, extract them all, and then print a hybrid? Well, there's 2 ways of doing it. And one way is you need a persistent marker in the mouth, right? So in this case here, we put things called stab-ident ports in the patient's mouth. So you want to have anatomy that is the same when the patient has teeth as when you pull all the teeth out. And the short answer is yes, you can do it. There's lots of different ways of doing it. There's a new product that I want to try out called the Rosen tray, which is actually a polyvinyl impression tray that you can take of the soft tissue. The bottom line is you can do it, but it's really hard. And the reason why is those markers have to stay put during a 4 to 6 hour surgery. And the chances of you dislodging them, and if you look at the image on the upper left and the lower left, you can see that a couple of those stab-ident ports have kind of fallen out. So those things have to match up. So really the best way is still the old-fashioned way, which is to do a converted denture, let the patient heal up, and then deliver the prosthesis. Another way of doing it is a stacked guide. And so if you guys know, or we talked about it a little bit in previous lectures, what a stackable guide does is you've got a metal frame that functions as a bone reduction guide. And then the surgical guide and the prosthesis snap into this frame. And this prosthesis that you see is basically a denture conversion. So it has a hole, and you put temporary titanium cylinders into the implant, and then you pick this up. So a little fancier version of a denture conversion, but still the same principle. So you start by scanning the patient. In this case, just for fun, we had 3D printed models made of the patient, scan them in a cone beam, scan them with an intraoral scanner, and then the lab takes it from there. Everything centers around this bone-supported framework. This is not a tissue-supported guide, and so we don't have the errors that we have with a tissue-supported guide. So we just get this frame in, extract the teeth, do our bone reduction, and go from there. And I got a buddy of mine who does these a lot, and he's like, oh, you know what you want to do is when you do your bone reduction, just cut through the teeth and cut through the bone, and it's really fast that way. Well, I tried that on the upper arch on this patient, and it didn't really work. So my advice is get the frame in, extract the teeth. There's a jig that you put on the teeth, so you want to make sure you get your framework in before you take the teeth out, or you're just hosed. Then do your bone reduction. It's a lot quicker. After you've done your bone reduction, we can now put in our surgical guide frame into the bone frame and do our guided surgery. One of the cool things about this system, this was done by Dr. Corey Glenn, is that it's very open. And so there's lots of irrigation and you can really see where your drill is going. After you've done your bone reduction, you can put temporary titanium cylinders and do a pickup. So this prosthesis snaps into the bone frame with magnets, and your midline's right on, your occlusal plane is right on, and your occlusion is right on. And so when you do the conversion, I use a system called QuickUp by Voco, which is a composite that can bond to both acrylic and composite, 3D printed. This is a 3D printed with On-X resin from Sprint Ray. And so you just cover the multi-units with rubber dam material. It's really easy to pop these on. You just cut basically a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter square, or actually 2 centimeter by 2 centimeters square of rubber dam material, do a punch in it, and then put the temporary titanium cylinder on there. So let's talk a little bit about photogrammetry. And what photogrammetry is closer related to is augmented reality, more so than intraoral scanning. So with augmented reality, we have an iPhone that either reads a QR code or scans a person and superimposes data on the top of that. So with a photogrammetry scan, we're using a domino, basically a scan body that has a pattern, and by using augmented reality, a 3D model of the analog is then positioned relative to that. So what's the flow? Like, how do we do all this stuff? Well, one thing that's probably the most important part of a digital hybrid is how are you going to get the patient's vertical? Like, how do you get the patient's bite? And so you may have teeth in the mouth and the patient's biting, or you may have a converted prosthesis in the mouth. But we need some sort of shared anatomic data between when the patient had something that was maintaining their vertical and when we take that out. So I use a soft tissue composite. So we'll talk about what I use and how I do it. But you can see here in this scan, I've scanned the patient's converted denture in the patient's mouth. I've made these little squiggly lines on the patient's attached tissue and recorded the buccal bite of this patient. The next scan is also done with an intraoral scanner. So all this is done, in this case here with the CIREC Prime scan. We put these little sort of mini scan bodies on the multi-units. And actually, if you're a BioHorizons user, you actually just use the protective cap of the multi-unit. You scan that as well, but you got to make sure those markers match the markers when the patient had a prosthesis or teeth in their mouth, because that's going to give you your bite. Think about this. When I take the prosthesis out and I put these little soft tissue markers in the patient's mouth, patient's overclosed, right? They have no teeth in there. So we have to match up the two. Finally, we're going to do one more set of scans, and that is with the photogrammetry device, either PIC or iMetric. We're going to scan these markers in the mouth. So one thing that's really important, again, is to have this persistent data, right? To have this anatomy when the patient has something that's maintaining their vertical. And so I use a product called Liquidam. If you're familiar with the Philips, it used to be Discus Dental, but the Philips Zoom whitening system, this is the material we use to cover the patient's gums so the peroxide doesn't burn them. One pro tip is that gingiva is really not meant to be bonded to, right? So it's very hard to get these to stick for very long. What I found was if you take bonding agent, dry the tissue, and put a lot of bonding agent on the gums, and then light cure the bonding agent, that gives you a much greater bond to the tissue than just trying to bond to the tissue, wet, movable tissue. And it's kind of hard to get off, so it really makes it stick. So make sure you place bonding agent on the tissue first.